Howdy, folks. Hope you're having a good day. Let's see if I can actually pop out this stream chat so I can actually read it while I'm doing things. Crazy talk or something. Even crazier, we have an accurate title for the broadcast today, not Do Not Watch. So maybe some people won't be turned around by that. That'd be good. Let's also make sure that we have the right URL in the actual announcement. Alrighty. Where's my OBS? There's my OBS. For those of you who are here, you're probably not like the ideal audience to be asking this. I should be asking the people who aren't here. But would an here in the Discord just grabbing everybody's attention, being like, hey, we're starting the broadcast now. Do you feel like that's a good place to use that sort of message? I don't want to, of course, spam the Discord with notifications because, but broadcasts are a time-limited thing. Hitting only the people who are online, maybe that's useful without being too overwhelming. I've got one vote agreeing with me, so that's like 200%. I think we might do that. Yeah, we're talking a little bit about broadcast planning. This week and next week we're planning on, 3 broadcasts this week. Next week, spoilers, we're going to be doing an AMA with Tim Shields, who's the CEO of Cascade. He's going to be able to hang out in a call and answer some questions. That means we're going to be doing 4 broadcasts next week. And then after that, when we get into the level 1 material, we're going to go down to 2 broadcasts a week. So it shouldn't be too spammy. And then every once in a while we'll have like a program update where we're like, hey, everybody should pay attention. Like when we do exams, I'm probably going to tag at everyone because that first exam I know is going to be exciting for a lot of people and a lot of people are going to want to pay attention to that. But yeah, you know what? While we're just chatting here, I don't know if everyone will join the events. We had 30-ish people respond to this event and to yesterday's event, and we had about 90 people show up for the stream at some point or other. And so I don't think it hits everybody, but events is definitely a good reminder. And in case, how are folks doing today? How are folks doing? I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to actually go through the lesson. In the future, my plan is to do these broadcasts the day after the lesson. That way you have closer to 24 hours to find time to watch the lesson rather than you have to be there when the lesson goes live, watch it, and then jump immediately into this broadcast. To join the Discord, if you just go to nexus.cascadegames.com, at the bottom of, or right in the middle of that page, there should be a link to the Discord. A broken hand doesn't sound great, but I'm glad that you're good other than that. About to wrap up work, better in 30 minutes. I mean, yeah, I can understand that. I have a lot more work to do as soon as we're done after this broadcast, working on the first few lessons for level 1, getting some other stuff done, trying to get some clarifications in for rules and policy, because those can use some work, even though they're already in a pretty good spot. Posting the lessons as a podcast, just the audio, that's interesting. Not something I'd considered, but being able to subscribe to that is, yeah, super reasonable. That's something that I will try to find time to set up, and then publish it to all of the various hosting sources and get those links in there. We do now have the lessons available on YouTube, in addition to them being hosted on Vimeo as well as these broadcasts. They are going to be available on YouTube. I'll put the link somewhere. I don't know if the link is available right now. I think if you search SWU Judges on YouTube, you should be able to find the first 2 lessons. I've set it up to automatically upload lessons when they go live. I don't know if that's actually going to play out. I don't know how technology works. We're doing that for the first time. But yeah, creating a podcast so that you can just subscribe and get those updates when they're ready is really good. Having this in as many forms as possible, so it's as accessible as possible, is one of our goals. So yeah, I can definitely take some time, probably next week, to put it together and turn it into a podcast. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, Teaching Star Wars Unlimited. So yeah, we start with teaching the game rather than going into any of the rules, because teaching is so fundamental to how you function as a judge. Every interaction you take, you are going to be answering a question. Sometimes the question is, hey, what's the name of the card that makes me sacrifice a thing when it comes into play and whenever it attacks? You'll be like, oh, that's Avenger. Nice, easy question. Sometimes the question will be, hey, can I go use the restroom? Yes, you can. Leave your phone at the table, go to the restroom. Not a problem. Sometimes they're more complicated, like, hey, 17 turns ago we made this error. We've both made a bunch of strategic decisions based on it, and we'd really like to rewind to that point of error. We think we can do it, but we want to call you to solve it because we don't have that authority. How can we do this best? Sometimes it'll be somebody who's like, hey, I don't understand why I got a penalty for this, or why my opponent got a penalty for this, or why my opponent didn't get a penalty. And explaining those rulings and all of that is important to being a judge. We are not rules dispensers. We don't just stand there and somebody says, I have a rules question, then we just vomit out a bunch of words saying, this is, like, we don't just grab the CR and we're like, yes, CR 5.2.c, result is blah, 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 blah. We listen to the person, we take into account what they are asking, what they are trying to learn, and we do our best to help educate them so that they don't need to call us in the future. Well, we are kind of indispensable. In an ideal world, judges aren't needed because everybody plays perfectly, but I don't know if you've met Star Wars Unlimited players or players of any TCG. They are not perfect at playing the game. I certainly am so far from perfect. I make all sorts of errors, and I really should know better. I know the rules rather well. I know the tournament policy rather well, and yet I will make all sorts of goofs and gotchas, especially on like a pre-release night. If it's going late and it's like 11 p.m. or close to midnight and they're new cards, I'm going to make some mistakes. So, see, I didn't know what rule it was, but I have the CR in front of me, and if you just babble out numbers and then end it with a letter, there's a good chance that it's a rule. I do love the first rule, or first player rules, but that's a tangent for another time. Yeah, so this is the overview. That's pretty much what I was just talking about. I don't need to do it. Oh my gosh, please never apologize or feel bad about having to look up a rule. I look up rules all of the time when I'm having conversations, when I'm writing lessons. I was talking with Ryan Sereno, who is the rules admiral at FFG, the guy who wrote the comprehensive rules. And we were talking about how often he has to look up the rules. Now, his reasoning is the rules were written one way and then they changed how the rules work, and so it's different. But even then, if the person who wrote the comprehensive rules sometimes needs to look up the rules, please don't feel bad about having to look up the rules yourself. That's super reasonable. Anyways, let's get into these lessons. We're going to start partway into the presentation because we don't need to look at the title screen or the overview, so we're just going to cut over to that and dive on in. So, primarily for demos, figure out what's caught their attention, whether it be the theme, the mechanics, the art. At San Diego Comic-Con, the thing that was catching people's attention was a mix of the two, both the card game and the theming of it. At your local game store, where it's all games, they're probably interested more in the Star Wars aspect of it rather than the card game aspect of it. That's because, like, your store probably also carries a half dozen other TCGs, and so what has drawn their attention is the big old X-Wing and the big old lightsaber, and that's the exciting part. Um, Knowing what makes somebody excited about learning the game helps you run that demo in a particular way. Sometimes our demos were targeted towards people who are like, yeah, I'm a game designer and I just love learning new games. And we're like, great, let's like ignore the flavor of all of these cards and just talk about the neat rules interactions, how the game has this tactical depth from a relatively simple and easy to learn system, and that sort of thing. When somebody's like, I'm here for the lore and the flavor, you show them Luke Skywalker and I am your father and indicate that you can just relive and reenact that scene, and that's a great flavor win. Or similarly, R2-D2 and C-3PO and other flavor wins like that. That's a great way to hook somebody in. When answering a judge call, it's a lot harder to learn about somebody, and you don't really care so much what drew them into the game. But something that you can do if you're digging deeper into a judge call is ask folks what their experience is with the game, how long they've been playing, that sort of thing, because that answer can help you understand the context of the judge call quite a lot. Give me a second while I adjust my microphone. We might make some noises. Right. So asking somebody how long they've been playing the game, I know I've seen some players do some very shady things. It's just like, anybody who's playing the game for any amount of time would know better than that. And you're like, hey, so how long have you been playing the game? And they're like, oh, I learned yesterday. And you're like, cool, I'm no longer worried about you doing this intentionally. I'm just going to make sure that you're aware that in this game, units come into play exhausted, not readied, like they do in many other games. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And then they correct their play and move on. If somebody's like, oh yeah, I've been playing for years and years, it might be, oh, back in 2024, 5 years ago, before the Water Wars, the rules were a little bit different. We had some different mechanics. They've changed since then. That's something that comes up in TCGs that last longer and go for a longer amount of time. The rules do change. We've already had some rules update that have changed how cards work. For example, if we look at Unit Boba, the exact functionality and how it interacts with leaders has changed since set 1. And that's only been a few months. And so if somebody says, yeah, I started playing with set 1 and then I played on release, played for 2 months, and then I haven't been able to play for the last 4 months because I moved, that explains to you why they've done something weird or have pushed for something weird. It's not necessarily malicious behavior. It might just be a lack of knowledge there. So this skill of picking up who a person is and what interests them and how they play, that is something that can be carried over into handling judge calls. Also, of course, if any folks have any questions, that sort of thing, please feel free to drop in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that as I go through this. And then we click to the next slide, and we go to the next slide. We do go to the next slide. Fantastic. Setting up for success. The context is always important. This is something that I repeat throughout the lesson, I don't know how many times, pretty much every single slide. I'm like, make sure that they have the context of the information before you give it to them. If you're talking about active player and what that means during the regroup phase, if they don't know what the regroup phase is, or if they don't know what an active player is, that isn't useful information for them. If you start using shorthand, ECL, that sort of thing, that doesn't mean a lot to a newer player. Using the full names of cards, pointing out the subtitles and including those, or being very clear about unit versus leader, that's hugely important. One of the challenges that over time you'll begin to face is that you forget how complex the game can be, and how many questions you had when you started. You'll just be surprised constantly by the unique and curious questions people will ask you about this game. I would not be surprised if, we have Kira up on here, if somebody said, hey, if Kira attacks a unit with 5 power and 3 health, does Kira win that fight because they do their damage one at a time, and by the time Kira does her 3rd damage, she'll have only been dealt 3 damage? That's a question that I've been asked in other card games, being like, yes, is damage sequential rather than simultaneous? You'll get some weird questions. The default knowledge, people have comes from a wide variety of places, and so having that context is always important. Another huge thing, as I mentioned, is talking about the game narratively. Star Wars has obviously a huge breadth of narrative and lore. We have all of the movies, the shows, the comics, the books, the video games. I'm sure there's more content out there that I'm forgetting, but there's so much narrative, and Star Wars is such a narrative universe that setting up this game to be an extenuation of that narrative is a great way to tie people in. People love Star Wars because of the lightsabers and the story. Let them play around in that. Having a game where they both get to win and have a satisfying tactical victory along with a satisfying narrative to go along with it will really grab them and really pull them in. Yeah, oh my gosh. The animated Clone Wars series. I'm not going to talk about how much I love both the Tartakovsky and the more recent Clone Wars shows, but they're great. We're going to leave it at that. And someday we'll have a broadcast where Joda talks about stuff that he loves about Star Wars, and it'll go on for a couple of weeks. Instead of going on that tangent, we're going to talk about language. Generally, when teaching the game and when handling judge calls, try to use the technical language of the game. Try to use exhausted and readied instead of tapped or untapped. Try to use the terms unit and leader instead of hero or commander, instead of monster or creature. But if the players are using those terms, whether it be in a demo or a judge call, you can absolutely use those terms just to make communication a little bit easier, as long as you point out the exceptions. For example, if somebody's coming from Magic the Gathering where units come into play untapped or ready, just mention that that's a difference between the ready and exhausted thing as opposed to Star Wars Unlimited where things all come into play exhausted. Similarly, when there's a judge call, or if you overhear a couple players using the wrong terms, oh boy, this is going to be fun. Something that players will do is they'll call things triggers that are not triggers, and that's okay. Not every ability is a trigger, and players will treat every single ability as though it were a trigger. Some people might say playing a resource is a trigger. They'll be like, yeah, resource trigger, I'll play this. You're like, what? That's a step in a phase. It's not a trigger. Players will call things whatever they want. They don't know the rules. And more importantly, they don't need to know the rules. That's what we're here for. And as long as their opponent's like, I understand that you are playing a resource during the resource step of the regroup phase, and there is no trigger that needs to be managed, that's 100% okay. You don't need to make sure that their technical language is correct. Colloquial phrases are a little bit of a tricky one, because over time colloquial phrases will come up. Saying that you're going to ECL something is a phrase that a lot of enfranchised players already know, because it's so ingrained in us that ECL means I'm going to use the epic action on Energy Conversion Lab to bring this unit into play and attack that unit. And you can say ECL Wrecker on your Child Sin or whatever, right? Like, we can understand that shorthand. The mill and heal from Vigilance, that's some shorthand that some people might not understand. I really don't understand how a card from 1993 in Magic the Gathering has become a term that, like, a lot of people who play games know, but generally try to use those non-colloquial terms. However, bounce, mill, scoop, buff, those are terms that a lot of people will understand, but it's not terms that necessarily everybody will understand. It's been really fun seeing this growth in TCGs. So not only Star Wars Unlimited, but seeing Flesh and Blood grow, seeing Lorcana grow, seeing One Piece grow, and then going to events where several of these games are next to each other. And I listen to the judges or players for a game that I'm not familiar with talk about plays or rulings, and they're throwing around colloquialisms and shorthand. And I'm like, oh, this is what people have been telling me that I sound like when I talk about Magic for the past 2 decades. This makes a lot of sense. It does sound alien, even though I understand all of the words. And with a new community, we want to make sure that we don't have exclusionary language, or that it's easy for people to understand what's going on, and so they can quickly ask, hey, what does mill mean, or what does bounce mean? And just not to overuse that language. Core of the demo. Core of a demo is actually going through a game. If you're teaching somebody, go through the steps of a game. With a ruling, it's important to go through the steps of the ruling as well. For example, if your ruling in a competitive game of Star Wars Unlimited is rewind to the point of error and then play on, don't just tell the players, okay, my ruling is you're going to rewind to the point of error and then play on, goodbye, and then walk away from the table. What you're going to want to do is say, okay, we're going to rewind to the point of error. What we're going to first do is return that unit that you played to your hand, unexhaust those resources, ready them up, and then you're going to undo your attack, and then we're going to do this and that and so forth, and walk through the entire thing, explain the context. If, for example, a card needs to change zones, obviously the players should know why that card needs to change zones. They were there when it happened, and it makes sense that we are undoing that. But explaining why you're doing it, and if it's a card, say, going on top of a deck temporarily, you want to explain that card's going to be on top of your deck for now, but when we resume the game, you're going to draw a card in a minute, so you'll be able to have access to that in just a second. It's just temporarily set aside effectively. Making sure that folks are aware of what's going on is fundamental to them understanding what's actually happening. A question about players are readying their resources. Let's see. Where players prepared their resources and ready their units before they resourced. I think that it is important to generally make sure that the communication is clear with regard to readying resources and that sort of thing. I'm just going to transition back to me while I talk about this. So this is something that is a bit of out of order sequencing. Right now in set 1, there is no real effect in playing all of your, or readying your resources, then playing a resource and readying it. That doesn't really have a huge impact as long as you're clear in your communication to your opponent. The important thing here is that if it's developed a shortcut of, if I ready my resources without playing a resource, a lot of people will begin to take that to mean I am not playing a resource, and they'll take action appropriately. And so I think it's important to let your players know that that shorthand might develop, and that a lot of people will see readying resources as a sign that you are not resourcing. While we don't have policy currently on out-of-order sequencing or shortcuts, that is policy that I'm going to be talking with FFG about shortly, and getting something formalized so that people are protected from taking shortcuts and playing in an efficient manner. That's something that's important. In the current term, getting people to play technically correct is generally recommended. What I would do with these people is be like, hey, this might cause some confusion, and if it does cause confusion, you're technically in the wrong. You are playing things in the wrong order. And so a judge is more likely to rule with the person who was basing their decisions off of the technically correct play. It's something I do every single time myself, because in Magic, the first thing you always do is you untap, you ready your stuff, and doing that first in Star Wars is technically incorrect. So the way I phrase it is, it's not a huge problem if you do it technically incorrect. However, it will potentially cost you if you continue to do it this way, because a judge is going to rule with the person who is technically correct rather than the person who is technically incorrect. However, I hope that we have shortcuts or out-of-order sequencing that allows players to do that in cases where it doesn't actually have impact on the game. That is a very good question, and that sort of ties into we don't want to penalize players for playing the game. We want to make sure that the game is played the way people actually play the game, and policy should be built around how people actually play the game. so many people will continue to ready stuff and then play a resource. As long as you say, I'm going to play a resource, and you ready your stuff first and then play a resource, that's generally going to be fine. But yeah, I think that's a crime that we are all guilty of, and getting some policy in there to help protect me in particular, because I'm important, would be great, especially, and protect players who are newer to the game. I think that's something I'd like to see moving on. Speaking of rewinds, yeah, we can go on a little tangent here. How do I feel about a player attacking a base when there's a sentinel in play? Do I rewind? If so, how far? This is something that isn't particularly clear in either documents, or like in the master event document or in the comprehensive rules. It doesn't say how far you should rewind. Pulling from the philosophy that I'm aware of, the ideals of making sure that the game is fun and fair, I would undo the entire action. I'm not going to go partially through an action. I'm going to essentially restart the turn unless significant information has been gained, like cards have been revealed and that sort of thing. I'm basing this a little bit on the rules in, 6.2.0 and 6.4.0, which are action timing and clarifications for playing a card and using an action ability. If at some point during those processes you're not able to complete them because it's illegal, for example, you don't have enough resources or something along those lines, if you're not able to pay part of the cost, you undo the entire action, and you're asked to choose a new action. It's possible that, like, you choose the same action but have the resources, that sort of thing. This is, again, something that I'm going to be talking with FFG about relatively shortly, being like, hey, there's not a ton of clarity here, and there's a lot of differing opinions because there isn't that clarity, and we want to make sure that we have consistent policies so that everybody rules the same way. And cutting back to our teaching. I love that clock swipe. It just makes me feel fancy. Alrighty. Moving on. Teaching Star Wars Unlimited in particular. Something you want when teaching the game and when answering calls, you want to avoid unnecessary information. When teaching the game, you don't really need to talk about aspects or aspect penalties or base abilities on rare bases, particularly if you're using starter decks or pretty straightforward demo decks. That information isn't relevant to the players at that time, and since they're not going to be making decisions based on it, then it's just extra information for them to hold on to in their head, and it'll push out something important. Give me 1 second. Great. Similarly, when answering a judge call, you don't need to give them information that they don't need. If somebody asks you, hey, how does this work? You really, really don't need to name the section and verse. It comes in the comprehensive rules. You don't need to mention exceptions to that rule unless they are relevant to the situation at hand. If somebody asks you about playing a card from Smuggle, you don't need to specify like all the various contingencies that come with playing a card from Smuggle. You can just tell them what they need to know to do what they want to do. Similarly, in a demo, if somebody has a question, or if you're teaching a step, teach them what they need to do when they need to know it. We'll talk about this a little bit on the next slide as well. Introducing mechanics as they come up. DT Sniper, yes, the PowerPoints are not currently available as standalone PowerPoints. I will make sure that along with podcasts as a separate upload, that's something that I'm going to try and do. It might just be like a Google Drive folder for the time being, but I would love to have folks have them as a resource to either teach judges who don't want to go onto the internet for whatever reason, or to teach players who are like, hey, I'm interested in learning the rules but also don't want to go on the internet. However, taking these and doing what I'm doing here just in your local store or in various other events is super valid. Like, one of the first things I did when I became a judge for Magic was running lessons in my store, being like, hey, who wants to become a judge? Here are some videos, let's talk over them, let's go over the rules. So yeah, making these available as both podcasts and PowerPoints are on the to-do list. But yeah, teaching Star Wars, it's a lot of just go with what comes up as it comes up. You don't need to explain how combat works until we're in combat, which generally won't be until the second round of the game, because people aren't going to be playing ready units and that sort of thing. Playing with your hand face up, that's something that I love doing because I like showing them the decisions that I'm making. If you're hiding your hand from them, you can make strategic misplays a little bit more easily, so you can help them win. But showing them your hand lets you point out what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then they can apply that knowledge immediately to their hand. And yeah, teaching and learning together is so much fun. And whenever somebody comes to me and says, hey, how can I learn the rules better? What is the best way to study? The number one best way to study, in my opinion, is teach somebody. Reading the rules is good. Playing the game, even better than reading the rules. But the number one way to get better at knowing the rules is teach it to somebody else. Because they're going to ask you a question that you don't know the answer for and are not prepared for. And so you're going to have to dive into the comprehensive rules. Pull out that information. Explain it to them. And then they're going to say, okay, but why? I don't understand. And then you have to get to the point of understanding where you can explain the ideas behind it and what the consequences of the decision being different might be. And so teaching people, oh, please, yes, do. I am excited for you to run in your store. Please let me know how it goes. That would be truly, truly incredible. All right, moving on. Demo tips and tricks. Don't try to teach mastery. The player isn't preparing for the Galactic Championships. They're not preparing for even a planetary qualifier. They're not even preparing for pre-release. They're trying to find out if they like the game. And so you don't have to tell them, oh, well, you could have killed me if you had done this. Or if you attack with that unit, then you'll be able to kill this, then play Luke Skywalker, defeat this unit, etc., etc. People want to play the game themselves rather than just have you play both sides of the game. If you want to play both sides of the game, draft a cube by yourself and do a round robin. I've done that a couple times. It's been fun, but not something I recommend because it takes a lot of time. I did that early pandemic when I didn't have a lot of socialization going on. You can tell what kind of person I am from that one statement. Moving on, because we don't need to talk about that for too much, verify communication. Make sure that folks are understanding what you're saying. The words sure and okay sometimes mean I 100% understand what you're saying and would like you to proceed. And sometimes it's okay, I need like 30 seconds to process this and understand what you're saying. I'll catch up in a minute. Continue. Or maybe it'll be sure, I don't get it at all. I trust you. I believe you. I don't understand what's happening. So make sure to listen to what they're saying. If you explain something, they say, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Be like, do you actually understand, or would you like some clarification? You can also go in depth when asked. I know I've been saying avoid going too far into the details, but it's if somebody is an experienced player, they're coming from other games, just be like, and they're like, hey, how does ambush work? Or if you have a guerrilla attack pod, and they're like, hey, so this has a trigger when it comes into play. How does that work with ambush? Because it looks like I can give it ambush, right? And being able to explain that interaction is really rewarding for somebody who's excited about that. For people who are newer to card games, which a lot of Star Wars Unlimited players are, making sure that you don't overwhelm them is important. I have some comments that I'm going to read real quick after I get to this last one. Work as a team. If you're playing in the demos yourself, if you're participating in the demos, try not to win too hard. I don't think of myself as a particularly skilled player. The last time I played in a competitive event, I went 2-7. One of those was a bye. One of them was, my opponent just not showing up. So, not great at playing games competitively, but when I play a new game, I have 2 decades of card game experience, and they very frequently do not have 2 decades of card game experience. And so I'm able to see tactical lines a lot more easily than they are. And so you want to just be careful that you don't overwhelm them. You can just let them win by making strategic misplays, but something else you can do is set them up for really cool and fun plays. If, for example, you're playing the Luke and Vader starter decks, and they're playing as Vader, you can intentionally put like your shield from Luke on a big unit before they've activated Darth Vader, but after they've played a villainous unit, and then you can be like, hey, by the way, you can use Vader to knock off my shield, or let them find it for themselves. And that moment of discovering, oh, I can do this and I can gain this advantage and get this big swing in my favor, that's really satisfying to a lot of players. Bumping over to the comments real quick, let's see what people are saying. Last week you did a free event to teach players how to play the game. That's awesome. Yeah. It's great. 28 players is huge, and I'm really excited to hear that. Something that we're trying to do internally at Cascade right now is coming up with, what does Chris call it? Let me pull up that name. Something like Bulk for Beginners, which is to take for every leader in every set. So that's going to be a lot of decks. We create a deck for them using just commons from that set and maybe 1 or 2 on-theme uncommons. So, for example, Chris has developed a very cheap, aggressive Leia aggro deck with a couple General Dodanas as the uncommon, but every other card is just a common Rebel unit. And it's building these cheap decks, which they're pretty much built out of draft chaff. So if you do a couple drafts, or after a draft with your regular players, be like, hey, does anybody have any commons that they're willing to donate either to me to give to new players or to the store to give to new players? A lot of people will be like, yeah, I have 17 copies of this common. I don't actually need all 17 of them. And they'll give you the commons out of their draft. You can use that to build some really cheap and effective decks. And that's a great way to get people started. Having an effective deck is very, very cool. We're gonna try in the near future to develop these deck lists, these Bulk for Beginner deck lists, and share them on the Cascade Games site. We also want to open it up to community contribution, so we as a group can brew some fun decks that are not only narratively interesting and budget friendly, but engaging and are effective decks. Because I know I'm not the best deck builder, although these restrictions do help breed creativity. But moving back to where we were. Oh, transitions. I'm so good. Thank you, Phantom Physics, for recognizing that I have learned that the transition button exists on my OBS. This is bringing us towards the end of the presentation. Demo games don't have to reach the natural conclusion. This is where teaching for demos and teaching in judge calls differs. In a judge call, you do want them to finish playing the game. In a demo, you're not as deeply invested. Sometimes people have other things that they want to do, or they don't love it. Even when the game ends, the demo doesn't have to. If you have time, you can invite them to another game. They can look through the other deck to see all of the cards that they didn't see. Talk to them about different ways that they can engage with the game. That means that you can talk about various products, talking with starter decks, going into buying packs, because people love buying packs and opening cool cards, especially with the fun options that are available in booster packs, with every pack having a foil and many having hyperspace variants. The most important thing to do when a demo ends is, if they enjoyed the game, make sure that they know how to play more. Something that is unfortunately very common is somebody will play a demo, they'll be like, I love this game, cool, I'm gonna go home, and then they forget to try to, they're like, I want to play some more, how do I do that? And maybe your store doesn't run events for whatever reason, or you're not able to restore events, and so let them know what your event schedule is, or if you're at a larger event, let them know what stores are nearby or how they can look up events using the Asmodee Event Finder when that's available, or other event finders, local communities such as Discords, Facebook groups, that sort of thing. With more experienced players, you can touch on more advanced topics, talking about the meta, talking about large tournament offerings, talking about feature set releases, that sort of thing. You want to avoid, I think, talking about the format meta and large tournament offerings with players who are newer to TCGs. They frankly won't care about it, and it will be overwhelming information. Talking about future set releases can be very good. For example, talking about Twilight of the Republic has definitely gotten some of my friends interested, because they're like, the new stuff is alright, but I like me my clones. And just being like, yep, Clone Wars are coming. We know that we're going to get an Ahsoka and a Grievous and maybe a couple other cards that you remember from the spoilers. Talking about that for people who are invested in a particular part of the story, that sort of thing. That's a great way to go about it. You can maybe dip into speculation about what sets 4, 5, and 6 are going to include based off of those names. But yeah, that brings us to the end. Our upcoming content is going to be on Friday at, I believe I have it scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern, and at different times around the world, because that's how time zones work. We're going to be doing a broadcast for our third lesson, which is, I believe, card types and card anatomy. That's going to be the first lesson no, it's not card types and card anatomy. It's got to be golden rules. It's got to be golden rules and fundamentals. I'm crazy talking. Yeah, golden rules and fundamentals on Friday around 9 p.m. Eastern. That's our first lesson that's really going to be diving into the comprehensive rules. For most of you folks who are the more invested and engaged members of the community, I think you're going to know a lot of this stuff, but going over those foundations and building up that solid baseline is, I think, very helpful, and getting this established pattern of having broadcasts is something that we want to do. Next week, we're planning on having 4 broadcasts, one on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the next 3 Apprentice track lessons, going over those. And then a bonus one on Tuesday. That's going to be an AMA with Tim Shields, the CEO of Cascade Games. I'm going to make a thread somewhere on the Discord so folks can contribute questions early, and then we'll just go over those questions. Tim and I will have a chat about the Judge program, what we're doing now, where we're headed. Please feel free to ask any questions you want. If we can't answer them, I just won't ask Tim those questions, and we'll move on. We are striving for as much transparency and communication as possible, so please ask the questions that you want to know answers to. For context, and I'm going to include this in the post, Tim is, as CEO, in charge of our business side of things. He's the one who makes the deals with FFG and Asmodee. He's in charge of merchandise and exclusives and that sort of thing. So that's the sort of stuff that you can expect him to answer. He's not going to be an expert in rules and policy or program structure. Those are probably going to be questions best answered by me, but that's going to be something that we're talking about. After next week, we're going to go from 3 lessons a week down to 2 lessons a week as we start the level 1 lessons. Lessons will be coming out Monday and Thursday, with the broadcasts set to be Tuesday and Friday, generally speaking, the day after. So that you get about 24 hours to watch the lesson rather than immediately afterwards. With that, I'm going to hang out here for just a couple more minutes, read chat for a second. If you have any more questions before we end the broadcast, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back in the Discord, because that's where I live these days. I see a lot of you talking about bulk decks. I think I might actually, after this, create a new channel in the Discord just for this, because it seems like a lot of you have already done this and have some ideas, and then we can just go freaking nuts in there. So I'm really excited to talk about that with all of y'all, because my collection, frankly, is mostly commons and uncommons, because I haven't acquired too much product yet, and so being able to build some fun decks that I can use to rope in my friends sounds absolutely fantastic. Like Koi Boy, you made a deck for every single leader. That's incredible. That is so cool. Um, Doing bulk decks for Twin Suns and Premiere? Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to figure out about the best way to format that for the Discord. I think maybe having a forum so people can put like the deck title or the leader that they're brewing, and then just having a general discussion channel as a separate thing so that we can have general discussion about the philosophy of bulk decks, and then a forum area where people can be like, here's a specific deck that I want to talk about. Oh, I really like that physique. Making half decks for Twin Suns, so you can just jam two decks together. That sounds really fun. That reminds me a lot of Jumpstart from Magic, but just being able to be like, yeah, you can play a standard deck or you can play a Twin Suns deck. That sounds really cool. Maybe even a couple rule breaking decks where you build a Twin Suns Kylo Rey deck for the people who are fans of Kylo and Rey together. But that's all for now. I'll see you folks in just a couple days with lesson number 3. Have a good one.